think teaching change is really, really difficult because it's something you have to feel. I think the impact comes from knowing what it feels like to go through change, experiencing not being in control and having to navigate that. I had that during my internship at an abstract level because I knew I wasn't staying. I wasn't economically dependent. I knew after my internship I would go back to university. This was not going to be my professional life for the foreseeable future. So it affected me much less than my colleagues. But I think even that passive experience of that fear makes you look at how organizations work, the role that leadership plays in that in a very, very different way. And I think teaching as much as possible needs to involve the emotional side. And even if it is the scary side of things, to motivate you to do things well for yourself and for other people through relationships, there has to be an emotional component.
Welcome to Return on Empathy, a podcast brought to you by the Empathy Collective, a community where leaders come together to navigate change without losing their humanity. Whether you are a plant manager trying to humanize the factory floor, a small business owner wanting to build a strong culture that lasts, or a corporate executive striving to prevent burnout in your team, you belong in this community. Visit theempathycollective.com to join the waitlist for our community and use the discount code ROEPOD102 to get 10% off your membership. Change is often taught as a process, a framework, a series of steps designed to move organizations from point A to point B. But anyone who has lived through change knows that it rarely unfolds that neatly, because change doesn't happen on paper. It happens to people. In today's episode, I'm joined by Therese Grohnert, Associate Professor at Maastricht University's School of Business and Economics and Program Lead for the university's MSc in Learning and Development in Organizations. Together, we explore what happens when business education makes space for the human side of change. From resilience and habit formation to finding purpose in moments of uncertainty, this conversation offers a powerful glimpse into how future leaders are learning not just how to manage change, but how to lead people through it. This is Return on Empathy. Welcome to the show, Therese. It is so nice to have you here. I know we've been in collaboration and working together for over a year now. So It's really nice to formalize this and also share your expertise with my listeners. All of you are in for a real treat. Therese is wonderful, and she's leading a wonderful program at the University of Maastricht. But before we dive into our collaboration and the details of that, I'd love to just start with you. You mentioned your brief stint in corporate and your experience with change was a little nightmarish. So
Yes.
I'd be interested to hear that story. And then also how you've brought those learnings into your Master's in Learning and Development in Organizations program, and how did those learnings from your time in corporate impact the way you lead and educate those students, and what excites you about how you are doing things differently from what you experienced?
All right, let's start with the story. So I finished my bachelor's degree in business and in economics, and then I thought some experience and practice is probably called for before going on to do my master's. So I did an internship for, I think it was 10 months at a company that at the time was in deep, deep trouble. We were hemorrhaging money. It was clear for people that things are not going well, that there were a lot of changes. We switched CEOs, I think twice in the time that I was there. The communication was trying to be upbeat and positive and encourage people, but the atmosphere in the company was very, very strained while I was there. And after a while, when the official communication continued to be quite positive and upbeat, the elevator that I was using to go to lunch every day started to have little post-it notes on it where people were expressing their fears and their frustrations, and they were quoting from the official communication in a very sarcastic and cynical way. Some people were doubting, well, I wonder how many times I still get to use this lift before they fire me. Or I wonder if they know that some people have health issues because of how the situation is being handled. So there was a venting of emotions that didn't happen between the colleagues in conversations, or at least not with me as an intern, but people did put these anonymous post-it notes up, and internal communication took a picture of the post-it notes, shared it on the internet and said, "Oh, look, everybody is so comfortable voicing their feelings and their opinions," and that's not what that was, and that didn't help. So people took down the post-its and they didn't reappear. And I had colleagues who were crying in the bathrooms. I had colleagues who were worried about paying their mortgage. I had colleagues who were calling in sick. It had a huge impact that it was not clear how the company was handling this difficult situation, what would happen to people, especially those that had been with the company for 30, 35 years, that were wondering what is going to happen to me in the labor market. Are my skills going to be appreciated elsewhere? What is my future? A lot of younger people started to apply elsewhere and to leave voluntarily before the ship was sinking. And then after my internship was done, I went back to studying, and within half a year, that part of the firm collapsed, and yeah, hasn't existed since. Some colleagues managed to join the company that had acquired some of the assets of that company. They were all right, but many people had to scatter, had to move with their families. And there was, yeah, all of the scenarios that they were afraid of that came true. And because I was an intern and people knew that I wouldn't be there long term, people shared how they felt maybe a bit more openly with me. And I was spending a lot of time at the copy machine, which says a lot about my experience in that company too. And people would stay for a chat as I was digitizing a lot of documents. And they would tell me how they felt and what they were observing and how they felt about the culture of the place. And one of my first conclusions when that internship was done was that I'm not going to go corporate. I'm not going to do this to myself. I didn't see the fulfillment in people. I saw the fear, and of course it was an extreme situation. I fully realized that, but my 21-year-old self thought, okay, I'm not doing that. That doesn't seem like an environment I want to be in anymore. And I went back to university for my master's. I studied learning and development in organization, the program that I'm now leading. And that is a program that focuses on how learning is an essential element of anything you do at work, and specifically for change. That is why it resonates for me so much, is it's a positive way of approaching change. You can look at change as something that gets imposed on you from the outside. And you can also reframe it as, okay, this is giving me the opportunity to do something different, to experiment, to try something. But that means you have to have some level of confidence that you know what you're doing, that you know how learning works, that you have a network that allows you to do that. And for me, I enjoyed studying that subject so much. And I also experienced that kind of environment with the teachers and the educators that I came across. So when I then graduated from my master's, which was in the middle of the financial crisis, I was very thankful that I was offered a job there. I could stay. And now after a lot of different stops, I'm back in Maastricht. And yeah, I get to run this program. And I definitely carry those experiences, good and bad, from my corporate experience, even though it was brief, but also my positive experience from academia with me in the way that I teach and what I teach to the students.
It's wonderful that you were able to take that horrifying experience and translate that into something positive and good that will prepare future leaders to hopefully prevent or avoid that same situation. But I'd love to go back to that story a bit before we get
Mm.
into the program we're working on right now. The Post-it notes, to me, I mean, that cry for help. I've gone through tough times in organizations, and never did it escalate to the point where there were like literally notes in the elevators or something like that, but you would hear verbally at the water cooler, at the copy machine, like where you were standing most of the time, you would feel that fear in people because people would talk about it. I just wonder, as you're preparing students for going into organizations that may not be going bankrupt, but are going through unprecedented levels of change. I mean, that seems to be the common currency right now, is just upheaval, change. Here in the United States, we're seeing layoffs left and right, and top talent being laid off in the tech sector, in biotech, and it doesn't matter what industry. There are some highly qualified, really talented people being let go right now, and lots of people being let go, mass layoffs happening. So it's not creating a positive sentiment in the workplace, especially for people who remain. So what does that mean for learning and development in that kind of environment? Because I get a lot of newsletters on learning and development, and the training industry organization, and I see kind of what's trending right now. And it seems like L&D leaders are struggling to have a voice in some cases. What are your thoughts on, how you're preparing students to come into this really turbulent environment with learning and development?
So I think the nice add-on, that is the main threat, that many organizations who might feel that they are under attack in some shape or form that need to economize that learning and development is an easy way to do that in the short term, underestimating what that could mean in the long term. And our students are very aware of that. Most of our students work next to their studies. Many of them already work in HR or L&D positions. So they have the insight from practice as well as the academic side from us. And they notice the shift in the strategic importance that is attributed to L&D versus other functions. And that is something that they're scared of. What we try to do is we bring in as many L&D professionals as we can to give them perspective on what the strategic relevance of L&D can be. We are an interdisciplinary program that combines learning sciences, or the psychology of learning, with economics, with business, so that our students speak the language of people that make strategic decisions, that they don't come in as trained psychologists who then have to find their way in a business environment. They know about a business environment. They know about the economic market level developments that will affect organizations and the choices they make, so that they can speak the language and they get exposed to challenges early in a somewhat sheltered environment through the experience of other people, and having us as educators be there with them to reflect on those challenges. But it's not something that I think we can fully prepare people for. We can make them aware. We can give them language. We can give them the skill to adapt and to learn to have good conversations. That is where our preparation for that role ends, especially in turbulent times like these. But they will have each other. They will have the other alumni in the program. They will have the educators that stay available for them if that is something that is useful for them or their organization. And I think that network and that ability to learn and adapt, that's the most important thing we can give them.
Absolutely. And I fully believe in that, building that strong sense of community and support, even beyond the learning and the education. And you actually brought up an interesting point around merging the business program and learning and development for organizations. I remember having a conversation with you, and I can't remember the details, but having gone through the business program at Maastricht, I know what that curriculum is like. I've mentioned this several times on my podcast with other leaders who've been through business school, is that we're never taught the human side of leadership. We're taught the mechanics of leadership. This is how you develop a sound business strategy. If you want to go into finance, this is how finance works. This is supply chain. So you have all these components of running a business successfully from an execution perspective. But I never had any formal training on leadership, because you go into a business and you have to lead. It doesn't matter if you're the CEO or if you're managing a team of 3 people. You have to understand how to lead people through change, through whatever's happening in the company to get to that end goal and that final state. And so that's always been, for me personally, a bit of an uphill climb, because I've had to kind of self-teach that component. And I know you were saying you even saw this as between the business students and the students in your program and learning and development. That, remind me again what that observation was.
So the setup we have is that some courses are just for the students of our master's program, and in some courses they are mixed with students who study other business courses.
Mm.
So in that sense, sometimes they are just amongst themselves, and sometimes they intermingle with people who choose different studies. And it might be partly a self-selection effect, that we attract people that care about people, and that we have students that are very caring and that are very driven to learn and to do well by others. And oftentimes I've experienced it myself, but I also hear it from my students regularly, that they feel there's less warmth among the students that are in the business track compared to our learning and development track that includes business, but also has the psychology side, also has the economic side. That giving people room to speak in seminars, in lectures, is something that is less self-evident, maybe in a business course, that there is more of a feeling of competition, of wanting to be seen as the best one in that class. And that is something we do not simulate in our program. We do not grade participation, for example, to discourage people from speaking up because they have to speak up. We want people to speak because they feel comfortable, because they have something to say. And if it takes them a bit longer, then that's fine, right? They can take the time to find their voice. I find that very important. And that can clash with a more classic business education. Even though I have to say in Maastricht, of course, we use problem-based learning, which means that we have very few lectures and our students spend most of their time studying in smaller groups of up to 12 students. And many of our sessions are student-led, which means we give our students early exposure to managing group processes, to addressing conflict, to establishing norms, talking about team processes that are or are not effective explicitly. And at the master's level where I'm teaching, I have very high expectations for my students for doing that. So I might prompt them to reflect on team dynamics. If a group is not running smoothly, I will name it, but I make the group responsible for figuring out how to solve the problem and how to collaborate more effectively, because I think those are key skills you need after graduation. And there's no point in me sheltering them from that responsibility. And that is something our business students are also engaging in, but the values, the underlying culture, I think in the programs can be quite different based on who we attract, but also the examples that we set and the policies we put in place as educators.
That's fascinating to me. You mentioned sensing more competition amongst the business students. I always felt that as well when I was in business school, not just in Maastricht, but in the US as well. And a lot of leaders I've interviewed on this podcast have talked about how the approach to running a business is centered around the competitive piece. And you find a lot of people vying for the same senior level positions. So you see competition there. Some people will at all costs step on someone else to get to a promotion and more senior level role. So it's interesting. It's almost like we're promoting this type of culture in organizations. Meanwhile, you have this learning and development component, which is a very integral part of leading a business that then sits inside an organization and almost acts against that type of culture. But what you're doing in learning and development is so critical to help business leaders with the human side of leading an organization. So let's talk about that piece, because I that's one reason why you and I came together to work on a program for your students around the human side of change. I thought it was interesting when we first had a chat last year, you were saying that your students go through the curriculum and they get to a certain point, and then they just start getting curious about the human side of change. You gave us all the tools to understand the technical side of change management. It all makes sense. But how does it work with dealing with people and resistance and emotions and all the post-it notes in the elevator? Why is it that the human side of change, or even the human side of business, is often left out in academic programs? Or what are we missing here?
I think there's multiple answers to this question. One might be what feels manageable and what feels in control and what doesn't. And what feels like you're in control is having systems, is having frameworks, is having steps. That gives you a feeling of, I know what I'm doing. And even if there's chaos around you, you have something to hold on to. So if you think of education offering a scaffold to people who are only entering a profession, not talking about students that already work or have a lot of experience come back to school, that's a different story. But for people that come from their bachelor's education into their master's, giving them structures, scaffolds to hold on to as they start to navigate a world that must seem absolutely crazy to them, I think is basically first aid, right? You have to have something to hold on to. You have to have orientation in some shape or form. And models and frameworks are abstracted, simplified ways of communicating what people have been experiencing. So by itself, I don't think there's anything wrong with teaching those kind of models. What the key is in what do you do with those models and how do you contextualize them? And I think in curricula that are quite full, that might want to move students through a lot of content that might not be given enough room. That is, I think, one facet. Another facet is when I talk to colleagues at our business school from other domains, they have very different assumptions about what makes people tick. My assumption is, how do I connect with somebody? How do I help the person be motivated intrinsically for what is going to happen, what is the role for their learning and development, how can they find fulfillment in the way that they work with their teams, how do they develop the skills that are necessary to perform and to go through that change. A lot of colleagues are thinking from more of a compliance perspective. What kind of incentive do I have to take into account or to put in place for people to show the behavior that is desirable? And that is a much more mechanistic way of looking at it, while mine is a very relational way. And those two ways of looking at how humans tick give you vastly different answers and vastly different approaches to anything. I even see it in the teachers that we have at not just our school, but at people that I meet in academia more broadly. We have very different assumptions of what makes people do certain things. And that will determine how we approach it. And if there's a dominant view of compliance, that is going to find its expression in cultures, in organizations, but also in cultures of business schools. And if there's an assumption of a relational dimension to change, to learning, to development, that is also going to find its expression in those same cultures if you let it. And the question is which one is dominant and how do those cultures play together?
And this is actually a key component of the change conversations module that we collaborated on with you for your students, because we wanted them to see the impact of those two different cultural dimensions. So from a compliance perspective, or dangling the carrot and stick, like here's your incentive for making this change, that may work on the short term, but in the end, it's not going to drive sustainable change, because there's not intrinsic motivation there. But if you're building a culture of caring, or you're working on building relationships, truly listening to people, understanding their concerns, when we take the time to pause and listen to people and understand where they're coming from, we actually create more sustainable change that way, because we get to the root cause of the potential resistance or the reasons why they might be hesitating to change. And so it sounds really basic, but I think what you're saying with the relationship building piece, that's so critical. Because if we take the time to make those human connections and understand each other, we're able to get over those hurdles of resistance, or resistance
Mm.
just doesn't even happen. Because what resistance typically isn't, oh, I don't want to do this. It's, I don't really understand. Can you explain that further? I'm not really sure how this impacts me.
Yeah.
So it's more just creating clarity, and that's through building those relationships and taking the time to sit with people. Is that what you're seeing and what you're hearing?
Yeah, so I think the point where in the past our students said, okay, we now know all of these beautiful models of organizational change and the different mechanisms, and it all makes sense. But that's not how things work. That is a sign that we are attracting students that have a more relational view and that are craving those kind of connections. I see them building those connections amongst each other, but also with us as teachers. For them to ask, but how does it work? What does that feel like? And how would I even have that conversation? That tells me that they are looking not with a compliance angle, but they are looking from that relational, that caring side. And that is very encouraging to me, because that means we haven't exercised that out of them yet. That means there's a group of people that have preserved that need that I think is very fundamental, is to care for each other, right? We're herd animals. So I find that very encouraging. And then I feel the role for me and for us, for all of us educators in that program, is to find ways to inject that caring side and to have students understand there is a compliance view, there's a caring view, and those don't have to compete. Those don't have to be better or worse. They each have their spots and they can each do great things if done well and in balance. Sometimes you have to be very clear on this has to happen, whether or not you're comfortable with it right now. This is the only choice we have. There are moments where this is absolutely appropriate, but it's going to be much easier to have those conversations when they are built on a relationship of trust that you have already established. Then acting for compliance, for efficiency is not going to be perceived as a threat, but it's going to be something where people say, okay, this is not my preference, but I do see your point. Let's do it, right? And that's better than people digging in their heels. So we always try to tell the students, you can ask people to do something and you can incentivize them to do something. If they're not capable, even if they try hard, they're not going to be able to do it. So unless I build the skills and the capabilities and the attitudes first, it's not going to happen. So you have to understand where people are, what they cannot do, what they are not comfortable with, the conditions under which they could achieve things. And if you then make sure that people get the space to use those opportunities, then they will be able to respond to incentives because they have the ability to do so. But overriding the learning step and immediately going in with incentives is fantastic for people who are capable and absolutely terrifying for people who are not. That's not going to be effective, not in the short term, not in the long term.
If you are loving this conversation with Therese, this is exactly the type of stuff we will be diving into in our brand new online community, the Empathy Collective. We're hosting a special launch event on July 15th at 12 p.m. Eastern, where you will meet some of the founding community members and hear a live panel discussion from 4 of our former podcast guests. Check out the show notes for a link where you can RSVP for this event. We can't wait to see you there. So what you're saying is it all comes back to empathy, truly understanding the person who needs to go through that change, what they're capable of, what their needs are. We covered all of these points with the students in the Change Conversations module. We dug deep into empathy, creating a culture of empathy versus apathy. We talked a lot about active listening and how important that is, connecting to a purpose and the purpose of the change and how that connects with the individual and the team purpose. So with all these elements that we put out there for the students, and it was a very interactive session, we really loved the curiosity and the great questions coming from the students as well. How do you think it changed their perspective on how to lead change?
So one big difference this year, which is the first time that you and Adine were joining us, I didn't hear the complaint of, yeah, okay, now we have those models, great, because I made sure that you get to meet with our students before that frustration sets in. So I asked you to join us about 2 weeks before they usually hit that wall. So they do have a bit of background of what is happening, what organizational change means, what that looks like. They have a theoretical understanding that they're developing. But I made sure they meet you before they hit that frustration so that going further in the curriculum on organizational change, they can already take your viewpoint into account. And this year was the first time that nobody came to me and said, oh, this is also theoretical. I don't know what to do with it. I had nobody say that this year. And I think it was due to you coming in at that particular point in time where they had a baseline understanding. They also have work experience, many of them, where that came together. And I think the main lesson that they remember is the connection, that has to be the starting point. I think that came across in the apathy, sympathy, empathy difference, the conversations that might seem empathetic but are actually not. That is something that resonated very strongly. I had a student who caught herself saying, well, I know this is tough, but try to look at it from no, I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to say that. So she stopped herself halfway in trying to reassure one of her classmates. It was beautiful. And again, I've been teaching them in the months after they've been through the module with you and with your colleague. Oftentimes they would emphasize, yeah, but before we can do anything, we need to know what their trust relationship is like. Yeah, but unless they have psychological safety, nothing's going to happen here, right? We agree on that. So it was a foundational thing that they, at that point, just thought that this is normal. And sometimes you have to remind them, like, yes, technically, this is what we want, but this is not always the case in practice. So what do we do to get there? So they had an assumption, yeah, but of course you need the relationship first. Done. It's like, no, we move back. What if in that environment, that is not what you're finding? It's something you want, but it's not there right now. What do you do? And then we got really nice discussions.
I love that, and I love that you shared their own reflections and their reactions to what they learned. To me, is you and I achieved something successful when you didn't get any complaints about or didn't hit that roadblock, because I think that was the goal, right?
That was exactly the goal. And I'm not sure they're aware that other people had that roadblock even. I didn't share that because I didn't want to prompt them into thinking about it like that. I'm not sure they are aware that that is something that could happen because for them it just didn't.
It's interesting because what they naturally experienced by hitting that roadblock is what I experienced leading change management in an organization. same roadblock happens when you don't take into account the relationship building, the trust, the caring component of change management. And you're literally just focusing on the management side of change and the technical side of change. Because eventually you get to a point where even if you have a sound strategy, you've done all your homework and your research, and you have a really robust rollout plan, you have a training program in place. So on paper, everything looks good. If you haven't equipped your people leaders to have those impactful one-on-one trust building coaching conversations with their people around the change, what does this change mean to our team? What does this change mean to you as an individual? How can I help you and support you as your manager to get you to the future state? If those folks aren't given the tools, that's where the roadblock happens. So just like your students getting to a certain point, once they got through the frameworks, I mean, it was parallel to my corporate
Mm.
experience where we got through rolling out the change strategy, rolling out the internal communications plan. Everything looked good on paper, but the people leaders were not equipped to have those coaching conversations with their employees, and that's where it fell flat. How would you say this experience changed your perspective on the way change should be taught in academia?
I think teaching change is really, really difficult because it's something you have to feel. I think the impact comes from knowing what it feels like to go through change, experiencing not being in control and having to navigate that. I had that during my internship at an abstract level because I knew I wasn't staying. I wasn't economically dependent. I knew after my internship I would go back to university. This was not going to be my professional life for the foreseeable future. So it affected me much less than my colleagues. But I think even that passive experience of that fear makes you look at how organizations work, the role that leadership plays in that in a very, very different way. Teaching as much as possible needs to involve the emotional side. And even if it is the scary side of things, to motivate you to do things well for yourself and for other people through relationships, there has to be an emotional component. And that's very difficult to simulate. You don't have the emotional component by reading articles, by going to lectures. You might get a small portion of it through simulations by running projects and introducing change and uncertainty deliberately to let people experience what that does. Ultimately, I think the core comes from connecting it to experiences people already have in their daily life. And that might be at work, that might be at their sports team, that might be volunteering, that might be changes their families have gone through in various forms. All of those moments can give you perspective on what change means and what it does. But you have to create safety and trust to have those conversations. Not everybody is looking forward to being vulnerable, sharing something that they felt was scary or that maybe didn't get managed very well, and it's something that saddens them. So you have to be sure that if you go there, you do that in a safe and protected way that lets people feel the emotion to a degree that it helps them to learn without overwhelming, because you don't know what you might be touching. You don't know what somebody's backstory is. It's something that's very delicate balance. I think leveraging the emotional side of why do people resist? In the majority of the cases, not about being obstinate or trying to not let your plans go through. It's not a deliberate action against somebody else. It's self-protection out of uncertainty, out of lack of clarity, out of fear. Meeting people there, I think you can only do if you understand what that feels like.
Yeah.
But doing that
Yeah.
in a formal curriculum in limited time and we have the luxury of teaching in smaller groups. We do have the room. If you have a group that feels very comfortable, we do have those conversations. But if I think of settings where you have lectures with 150 to 600 people, that is going to be a very different challenge than from having a discussion with 12 people. And even there, it's not always a given that you can create an environment that is safe enough to do that. But I think the emotional side, understanding what does it do to somebody, what can it do to somebody, and what is the potential power that I have to alleviate that and to address that and to bring the emotions to an area that is manageable, that might even be energizing. I think that is where the magic is happening. But I think in education, we can give people experiences and tools and ways to reflect. But I think the actual learning, the actual growth has to happen in practice. That is not classroom stuff. That is practice, informed practice, being prepared for practice stuff.
It actually reminds me of the partnership that we have with Reflection Point. They actually use storytelling as a way to exercise empathy and really put yourself in the shoes of the characters in the story. So that's one thing that we're trying to do to help leaders experience the emotions of another person in a more formalized context through stories rather than just, an academic article or a case study, which is it's always hard to really feel those emotions. But I love what you meant about using personal examples as well, because everyone has a personal example of change in their lives and really putting yourself back into the shoes of who you were in that moment during change or a difficult family situation. How were you feeling? What were your concerns? How can you put yourself in that situation again and try to understand how to carry someone else through a similar situation? So anyway, love this conversation and love that we're, gradually chiseling away at the emotional and the human side of change with students who are going to go out and make a positive impact in today's organizations. But I'd love to close the conversation with our fun little empathy torch exercise. So for those of you listening who haven't been introduced to this concept yet, because it's something new that we introduced this year, we're having each guest leave a specific empathy challenge or an open-ended question for the next guest. So I'm trying to create more interconnection between my guests because I've discovered that I have the luxury of getting to know all of you, and I know each of your strengths and areas of expertise, but you all don't know each other. And so we're passing the torch from guest to guest. And Tom, who was my previous guest, will share the empathy challenge that Tom had for you, and then I'll ask you to carry the torch for the next guest. So Tom, who's also in education, so it worked out just very coincidentally. He's a school principal for an elementary school here in the United States. And so the fact that you're in academia, just love that there's that connection.
The question that I came to relates to something that we talked about, taking care of yourself, which is how do you show yourself empathy when being a leader often requires high levels of personal accountability too? I know personally that kind of that balance of I don't like to make excuses, but I do like to give myself grace. So how do we show ourselves empathy? How are you showing yourself empathy when you're also trying to hold yourself to a high standard?
So it's still a learning journey. I'm by no means a master of this. What has helped me is to think of when I hear myself talking quite harshly to myself, that I ask myself, well, if I was talking to my partner, to my best friend, to a student of mine, would I talk to them the way that I talk to myself right this moment? I would never do that. I would not assign the same level of blame, the same level of responsibility that I impose on myself. And imagining talking to somebody that I love and that I hold very dear is neutralizing those very harsh thoughts that I sometimes have about my own performance or what I could have done better. And if that doesn't work, I make sure that I actually hear those things from the people that I love. And because they know me very well, they know what I expect of myself. They want the best for me. I can trust what they say, and I can have those voices be there next to the moments where I'm not very empathetic towards myself. So I think it's all about in the network and in the relationships.
I love that. And we actually recorded an episode last year on negative self-talk and the impact of negative self-talk on your health, actually. Whatever your internal narrative is, it actually shapes your physical well-being as well. So we're going to pass the empathy torch on to the next guest. What is your challenge or question that you have for the next guest?
I've been thinking a lot about compliance, relationships, what is the basis for how we interact? And one question that I have for the next guest, and I'm very curious to hear that response, is that it might feel showing empathy or focusing on relationships in interactions with people that have power over you, that have a more transactional view, that have maybe a more compliance view of things, might be seen as weakness, even though it's not. How can we make sure that empathy shows up as a strength and is not going to be interpreted as a weakness or something to exploit? And I think that is an important question, to have compliance and relationships exist together harmoniously rather than making it seem like they're pursuing different things?
I love that. That's an excellent question. I look forward to seeing how our next guest responds to that one. We get that one a lot in our consulting work, especially with people who have to manage up, not just down, manage up to, leaders who are seeing empathy as a weakness or something soft or not important. And so how do you handle that relationship?
Huge, right? There's nothing wrong with softness, but the way it is spoken about has devalued what it means and what it stands for, and that is a pity.
Yes, 100% agree with that. Well, that's a wonderful question, a great challenge for the next guest to reflect on. I'll pass the torch on your behalf and circle back with you on the response, and we'll
Thank you.
keep the collaboration going.
I'm very
Thank you so
curious.
much, Therese. It was so nice to have you here and talk a little bit about what you're doing with your students in the Netherlands. And I look forward to the next conversation we have, which I'm sure will be soon.
Very much looking forward to it as well, Rebecca, and thank you for joining us, and I hope you will join us again in Maastricht.
Thank you. Take care. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. And if you would like to join the waitlist for the Empathy Collective community, visit theempathycollective.com and put the discount code ROEPOD102 into the comments of the membership form to get 10% off your membership. Life is too short. Let's take care of each other at work so that together we can make this world a better place.